high-ranking foreign official after the new leadership has begun to form in the People's Republic of China. And the third point, I think, is that actually it is the first visit of Mr. Shoigu abroad after he has taken office. It symbolizes that our military-to-military relations are very stable, that they will continue to develop, and this is one of the most important foundations for mutual trust and for our mutual cooperation in the future.
Are you impressed by the top priorities of Mr. Sergei Shoigu after he took office not long ago?
Of course, it's so impressive in that it's only 2 weeks since he took over. He actually took over on the 6th of November. So in 2 weeks' time, he made such a whirlwind visit to China, which is less than 24 hours, and during which he had such important talks with his counterpart, and he also met with President Hu Jintao. And we also cannot forget the fact that in 2 weeks' time, we have accepted such a visit. So all the protocols are forgotten, and this shows the depth of the relationship between us.
Depth and maturity, if not sophistication, on both sides of the two militaries. Victor, what do you make of this surprise visit?
No, I think both the timing and the substance of this visit and the meetings are very important. Timing-wise, China just had the 18th Party Congress, and we just have the new chairman of the Central Military Commission. And also, recently, there has been a significant, profound reshuffling of the top brass in China. Therefore, between China and Russia, the top leaders, the military leaders, need to get to know each other, especially after this reshuffling. Substance-wise, I think this meeting is also very important because the United States is pushing for this pivoting back to Asia. The U.S. President, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, they were in Cambodia, in Burma, Myanmar, and in Laos, and the world is becoming very turbulent right now. Therefore, I think because China and Russia share many common interests on major international issues, it is very important for the two militaries, as well as for China and Russia, to strengthen cooperation, to improve understanding, and also to coordinate between the activities of the two militaries.
Thank you very much. Sergei, when top diplomats and security officials from so many major powers are converging in Asia to address the issue of security coordination, if not economic collaboration, what does a closer Sino-Russian security cooperation mean for the future of the Asia-Pacific region?
Well, I think that, first of all, this cooperation...
The boosters in terms of China's military build-up, that's the security across the Taiwan Strait has lost its significance. And do you think the close security cooperation between Moscow and Beijing targets a third major player?
No, I don't think so. I think for many years, if not for many decades to come, the Chinese military will remain defensive armed forces. China has no single soldier stationed abroad. China has no territorial ambitions against any other country, and China does not want to use war as a means to resolve any international disputes. Therefore, I would say the Chinese military, large in itself, but then China has the largest population and one of the largest size of the territories in China, in the world. So I think even the expenditure on the military is increasing recently. This is partially because the Chinese national economy is increasing very steadily, and also on a per capita basis, the Chinese military expenditure is still very small compared with that of the United States or other major countries in terms of their military expenditure. Therefore, I would emphasize that the military cooperation between China and Russia are very much based on this very firm and steady and long-term friendship between China and Russia. It is not aimed at a third party, and it is mostly for defense in nature. China and Russia need to cooperate in their defense interests.
I'm afraid in the domain of power politics, national interests would always come across as a top concern when we take a closer look at the security cooperation. But Sergei, in the opening speech, which is actually the keynote presentation of Mr. Hu Jintao at the just concluded 18th National Congress of the CPC, he mentioned clearly the importance of China to reorient our national resources to the safeguarding of China's maritime rights and maritime sovereignty. China got to rise. Perhaps it's a little bit too late for China to rise as a major maritime power. In this particular area, do you think more measures will be taken between Russia and China so that will join hand and become a stabilizing force in the Asia-Pacific region?
Well, I think that this military technical cooperation between our states will develop in all the spheres that are interesting to Moscow and Beijing. We have very steadfast principles according to which we develop those cooperation. One of them is that we very strictly abide by our international obligations. And in this framework, of course, we shall develop this military, technological and other cooperation in all the spheres, including the naval forces, where both sides will feel interest to it. If to speak about China's rise as a big maritime power, I think it's also absolutely natural, because up to now a significant bulk of the energy resources imported by China is coming via the sea lanes. The same is true of the export of the People's Republic of China, which is one of the major factors of development of the world economy, not only regional but world economy. In this respect, PRC has all the rights to maintain its legitimate interest in the oceans. And I think that what Mr. Hu Jintao has accentuated in his keynote speech is quite logical.
Today, the biggest story for millions of netizens here in China is that F-15, China fighter jet, has successfully landed on the board of our first aircraft carrier, the Liaoning aircraft carrier. Now, everybody knows that we imported this aircraft carrier, the basic bulk of the aircraft carrier, from Ukraine, former Republic of the Soviet Empire. Do you think in the future Russia is likely to export more of the advanced technologies in this regard?
Well, I'm sure. As I have told, there are very clear-cut framework for our military technical cooperation. We have our national security interests, both of our countries. We have our international obligations. We have our technological capacity. We have a wonderful experience of military technical cooperation in the past that practically contributed both to preservation of our defense industry and to growth of the defense capability of the PRC. In this respect, I think that, of course, this cooperation will continue, will broaden, and will strengthen.
Mr. Zhou, the specter of a China threat is looming larger as China facilitates this process of military buildup ever since perhaps the first Gulf War back in 1991. It happened to be the year when the former Soviet Union disintegrated, the end of the Cold War. But everybody is trying to figure out what the pivot to Asia really means for China's security, particularly the naval buildup. Now, as I said, as Sergei analyzed earlier, the rise of China as a maritime power will definitely be prioritized on the agenda of Mr. Xi Jinping, the newly elected chairman of the Central Military Commission. What do you make of the breakthroughs that China could have in engineering our rise as a major power in the as a naval power?
That's a good question. Actually, this morning I just gave a lecture to over 90 students from 50 countries in National Defense University, talking about the importance of a sea line of communication for us. Right now, the thing is that China has global interest, not only maritime interest, but also imports from everywhere in the world. So China has a lot of vulnerability in that all these straits, major straits, are controlled by other countries. So there are two ways for China to do. One, to become confrontational because the straits are not in our hands. The second, to become cooperative because we have to cooperate with other countries. And if we talk about the latest case, which is Chinese Navy's operation in the Gulf of Aden, for example, China has to cooperate with other navies because even if Chinese Navy want to protect all the ships in transit, still some of the ships are so far away from Chinese line of escort, and therefore the destiny of all the ships are left to the care of other navies who actually obliged. So this is a fine example of how, when China becomes stronger, should come into cooperation with all other international navies, not only to safeguard China's interests, but also to provide humanitarian assistance to the world.
While international critics about China's military build-up accuse China of not giving enough and sufficient transparency about the military build-up or the intent of China's strategy, they seem to have chosen to ignore that we went as far as to cut 1.7 million regular army at the beginning of China's modernization campaign. But we'll be back in a few minutes and continue to address the issue of China's security collaboration with Russia. Stay with us. Will military and technological cooperation between Moscow and Beijing expand to a new level with the first official visit to Beijing by Russia's new defense minister? Will China, Russia and the ROK form an anti-Japanese front and force Tokyo to make concessions on its territorial claims to the neighbors? As Russia and China insist on settling serious crises based on Geneva Agreement, how will the US and its allies handle their frustrations? Will the Shanghai Cooperation Organization rally Russia and China behind more of regional and global missions? Welcome back. Victor, recently Russia, China and South Korea held a joint security conference to address their burgeoning security mechanism in Northeast Asia. Do you think this means that the three powers are to join hand in forming a united front against the Japanese aggressiveness, particularly in terms of their attempt to negate the outcome of the Second World War?
No, I would say in the northeastern part of Asia, one danger looms very large. That is, there are people in Japan who want to rearm. They even want to acquire nuclear weapons. They want to constitute another threat to the neighbors and to threaten the peace and stability in this part of the world. At the end, Japan now has territorial disputes with China, with South Korea, as well as with Russia. And therefore, I think it is very natural and logical for Russia, South Korea and China to move onto the same page, because I think people in this part of the world will not tolerate Japan to revise the victory legacy of the Second World War. We have suffered so much at the hands of the Japanese imperialists, and I think we need to stand firm together in pushing back any attempt in Japan to abandon the pacifist constitution or to start to rearm Japan. But I would like to emphasize that this is not only up to China, Russia and South Korea to unite to oppose Japanese initiative like this. I think even countries like the United States will be on the same page, because Americans will also not tolerate any adventures by Japan in abandoning the peace constitution as well as to rearm itself.
The U.S. was the first and immediate casualty of the Japanese aggression at the beginning of the Second World War in the Pacific theater. Sergei, the Japanese, you never ever underestimate their sophistication and shrewdness in aligning possible forces to fight China. The rising economic power, that's their envy, of course. But do you think they will seize the opportunity to soften their territorial claims about the four northern islands in the hope of dividing the strategic partnership between Moscow and Beijing?
Well, I'm not a specialist on Japanese foreign policy, but what little I know about the Russian Japanese relations regarding these four northern islands, I think don't make me too optimistic. It is the idea that is ingrained very deeply in the consciousness of at least so-called right-wing forces or certain people in Japan. And I don't think that even in a situation like today's, Japan will undertake to change somehow its stance on these four so-called northern territories, which we called our Kuril Islands.
Mr. Zhou, spokesperson of the Pentagon, made it very clear that the U.S. will honor its commitment as the ally of Japan. However, all the security and the government officials from Washington, including Secretary Clinton, said very clearly that they would try to defuse the current tensions arising from Diaoyu Islands in the East China Sea.
Yes.
They will not let this escalate into an open confrontation between Japan and China.
Yes.
What do you make of the position of ambiguity that comes from Washington?
Well, I think the American government is really in a dilemma. First of all, the treaty was signed in 1960. According to Article 5, the United States do have an obligation to work with the Japanese government if they have a so-called common threat in the Japanese territory administered by the Japanese. So, but that came first. But then this kind of dispute between China and Japan, of course, has been long-standing, but it is not until recently that it actually has spilled out of control. So during American Secretary of Defense Mr. Leon Panetti's visit to China and Japan, he said the same thing. So I think it's the
recently,
wish.
security officials from Japan and Washington have come together to discuss the possibility of expanding their security commitments to cover perhaps the disputed waters near the Diaoyu Islands. What do you think would be the most likely response from Beijing and Russia?
Well, I don't think, as I mentioned last time during dialogue, the military, the Chinese military and the Japanese self-defense forces so far have been cautious in spite of what they have expressed, because the closest distance between the baseline and Chinese neighborship is 39 nautical miles, which is just in the EEZ. Right? So in this regard, we have not seen any Japanese naval ships or Chinese naval ships in the 12 nautical miles. So that kind of caution is definitely worthwhile.
At the same time, with the dissolving of the lower house of the Japanese Diet, Prime Minister Noda obviously toned down the aggressiveness of his rhetoric about the Diaoyu Islands. Instead, they turned to diplomacy for a possible breakthrough. But Premier Moon Jae-in refused to have a meeting with Prime Minister Noda on the sideline of the just concluded East Asia Summit meeting. But Sergei, what about the security collaboration between Beijing and Moscow within the framework of Shanghai Cooperation Organization? Peace Mission 2012 was held this year. What does that mean for the local security, for the regional security? Because some of the military observers and security officials from Washington and the other side of the Atlantic Ocean say that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is actually a small NATO organization. Do you agree?
I think that it is a totally wrong assumption, because Shanghai Cooperation Organization don't have the aim, don't have, in no document of Shanghai Cooperation Organizations you will find some state or some some state which will be named as an enemy of this structure. There are only the forces of terrorism or extremism, fundamentalism that they are fighting with. By the way, if we shall look at the actions of NATO, they might seem the same enemies, but they're quite a different offensive organization, I would like to say. And Shanghai Cooperation Organization is very important in a way that it creates, secure context for solving the most acute crisis. Look at the Arab countries. Because they don't have this context, each time it appears the need for change, it leads to very violent result with an enormous amount of bloodshed. And in Shanghai Cooperation Organization, we managed to, by and large, to avoid such developments in all the countries that constitute it. Even when in Kyrgyzstan they have some kind of violence, it has died out comparatively quickly, because all the strategic environment provided by this cooperation is very benign to those peaceful solutions. I think that all the military cooperation that is undertaken in the framework of this organization that serves this aim. So I think it's already a kind of very important stabilizing factor, not only in the central region of Eurasia, but globally as well.
Sergei, Susan Rice, one of the strongest candidates for being the next Secretary of State in the U.S., was so angry at Russia and China when we joined hands to block a draft resolution of the UN Security Council to end the violence in Syria. Now, for a while, it seems Russia and China have both returned to the best times when China and the former Soviet Union were so friendly and as strategic partners in the 1950s. How do you look at the joint efforts by Moscow and Beijing to block overseas military intervention in Syria?
You know, it is absolute. First of all, the aim of the foreign policy of Russia and China, with all due respect, is not to please some high-ranking official in some other foreign country. We just pursue our interest, and the reaction of those officials is on their consciousness. Then, number two, you know, the situation in Syria, as in all the other Arab states, is enormously complicated. Of course, there were some mistakes and there were some misgivings by the ruling regime in this country. But we also have to recognize that the social structure, the social fabric of the society, the religious and economic reality of this state is enormously complicated. And when, you know, all the sides in this battle resort to armed force, it is not very wise and absolutely counterproductive to stand on the side of one of them and to arm it and to declare that all the truth is on its side. Of course, everybody very much disdain all this, you know, all the reports from Syria when we see the dead people, etc., etc. But the military intervention and giving the arms to one side is not the matter to solve the problem, but it is, you know, to pour some gasoline over the fire. We can have different opinions about President Assad, but what he has said, that if we shall continue to do this, it will have not only the country-wise, but you know, region-wise implication. Probably is true.
Thank you very much, Sergei. Whether China and Russia would move forward together through closer military collaboration largely depends on the level of assertiveness on the U.S. and Japanese side. We are not their military cliff, nor will China suspend buying U.S. Treasury bonds, despite the declining credit rating of the U.S. federal government. The latest diplomatic maneuvers of the White House show that the Obama administration decides to prioritize rebalancing the regional economic arrangements to beef up the U.S. leadership competitiveness in Asia instead of a military reconfiguration alone. I'm Yang Rui, and see you next time. Bye for now.
High-ranking foreign official after the new leadership has begun to form in the People's Republic of China. And the third point, I think, is that actually it is the first visit of Mr. Shoigu abroad after he has taken office. It symbolizes that our military-to-military relations are very stable, that they will continue to develop, and this is one of the most important foundations for mutual trust and for our mutual cooperations and cooperation in the future.
Are you impressed by the top priorities of Mr. Sergei Shoigu?
Asia, the U.S. President, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, they were in Cambodia, in Burma, Myanmar, and in Laos. And the world is becoming very turbulent right now. Therefore, I think because China and Russia share many common interests on major international issues, it is very important for the two militaries, as well as for China and Russia, to strengthen cooperation, to improve understanding, and also to coordinate between the activities of the two militaries.
Thank you very much. Sergei, when top diplomats and security officials from so many major powers after he took office not long ago.
Of course, it's so impressive in that it's only 2 weeks since he took over. He actually took over on the 6th of November. So in 2 weeks' time, he made such a whirlwind visit to China, which is less than 24 hours, and during which he had such important talks with his counterpart, and he also met with President Hu Jintao. And we also cannot forget the fact that in 2 weeks' time, we have accepted such a visit. So all the protocols are forgotten, and this shows the depth of the relationship between us.
Depth and maturity, if not sophistication, on both sides of the two militaries. Victor, what do you make of this surprise visit?
No, I think both the timing and the substance of this visit and the meetings are very important. Timing-wise, China just had the 18th Party Congress, and we just have the new chairman of the Central Military Commission. And also, recently, there has been a significant, profound reshuffling of the top brass in China. Therefore, between China and Russia, the top leaders, the military leaders, need to get to know each other, especially after this reshuffling. Substance-wise, I think this meeting is also very important because the United States is pushing for this pivoting back to Asia.
Converging in Asia to address the issue of security coordination, if not economic collaboration. What does a closer Sino-Russian security cooperation mean for the future of the Asia-Pacific region?
Well, I think that, first of all, this cooperation...
The boosters in terms of China's military build-up, that's the security across the Taiwan Strait has lost its significance. And do you think the close security cooperation between Moscow and Beijing targets a third major player?
No, I don't think so. I think for many years, if not for many decades to come, the Chinese military will remain defensive armed forces. China has